In the vast, sun-drenched expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where the sky meets the water in an endless horizon of blue, the fate of the modern world hung by a thread. It was June 1942. To the casual observer, the Imperial Japanese Navy seemed invincible, a juggernaut that had swept across Asia and the Pacific with terrifying speed and precision. They had humbled the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, seized the resource-rich territories of the South, and pushed the Allies to the brink of collapse. But beneath the surface of this apparent invincibility, a trap was being laid, not with battleships or gunpowder, but with mathematics, intuition, and a desperate gamble. In the span of a single day, the balance of naval power would shift violently and irrevocably. 4 magnificent Japanese aircraft carriers, the pride of the Emperor's fleet, the very ships that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, would be reduced to burning hulks of twisted metal, sinking beneath the waves. This was not just a battle, it was a turning point. It was the moment the sun began to set on the Japanese Empire, and the moment the United States Navy rose from the ashes of defeat to seize the offensive. This is the story of the Battle of Midway, a miracle born of intelligence, courage, and sheer, terrifying luck. Part 1, Background, the zenith of the Empire, spring to 1942. To understand the cataclysm that occurred at Midway, we must first look at the world as it stood in the spring of 1942. For the United States, the months following December 7, 1941, had been a parade of disasters. The American public was reeling. The Pacific Fleet's battleships lay in the mud of Pearl Harbor. The Philippines had fallen, forcing General Douglas MacArthur to flee, and the Japanese war machine had rolled over Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The Imperial Japanese Navy controlled an empire that stretched across 1/8 of the globe. In Tokyo, this string of unbroken successes had created a dangerous psychological condition that some historians would later call victory disease. The Japanese High Command believed their own propaganda. They believed the Americans were soft, demoralized, and incapable of fighting a sustained war in the Pacific. They were convinced that one more decisive blow would force the United States to sue for a negotiated peace, leaving Japan as the undisputed master of Asia. However, the strategic situation was more fragile than it appeared. While the Japanese perimeter was vast, it was also porous. On April 18, 1942, that fragility was exposed in a way that shocked the Japanese psyche to its core. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, launched from the deck of the carrier USS Hornet, a feat previously thought impossible, and struck Tokyo itself. The physical damage to Tokyo was minimal, but the psychological impact was devastating. The Emperor, a living god in the eyes of his people, had been threatened. The Japanese Navy had failed in its primary duty to protect the homeland. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet and the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, felt this failure personally. He had long argued that the only way to secure Japan's flank was to draw the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a final decisive battle, a Kantai-Kessen, and destroy them once and for all. The Doolittle raid silenced the skeptics in the Japanese Naval General Staff. Yamamoto's plan, which had previously been debated and delayed, was suddenly given the green light. The target was Midway Atoll. Midway is a tiny speck of coral and sand, essentially 2 small islands, Sand and Eastern, surrounded by a fringing reef. Located roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu, it was the sentinel for Hawaii. Yamamoto knew that the Americans could not ignore an invasion of Midway. If the Japanese seized it, they would have a forward base from which to threaten Pearl Harbor, potentially forcing the U.S. fleet back to the west coast of the mainland. Yamamoto reasoned that Admiral Chester Nimitz, the U.S. Pacific Fleet commander, would have no choice but to commit his remaining aircraft carriers to defend the atoll. And that was exactly what Yamamoto wanted. He would use the invasion of Midway as bait. When the American carriers arrived to save the island, the massive Japanese fleet would be waiting to crush them. The plan, designated Operation MI, was complex, perhaps too complex. It involved multiple task forces scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. To the north, a diversionary force would attack the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, hoping to draw American attention away from the central Pacific. The main body, trailing behind the carrier strike force, included massive battleships, among them the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, serving as Yamamoto's flagship. But the spearhead of the operation was the Kido Butai, the mobile force. This was the most powerful naval strike force on the planet, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. It consisted of 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These ships were crewed by the elite of the Japanese Navy, with aviators who had honed their skills in combat over China and across the Pacific. They were battle-hardened, confident, and operating the deadly A6M-0 fighter, a plane that could outmaneuver anything the Americans could put in the sky. Supporting these 4 carriers were 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, and a screen of destroyers. Behind them lay the main body and the invasion force, carrying 5,000 troops ready to storm the beaches of Midway. Against this armada, the United States appeared woefully outmatched. In terms of heavy metal, it wasn't even a contest. The Japanese committed 4 heavy carriers, 2 light carriers, 7 battleships, and roughly 150 support ships to the operation. The United States had no battleships available. The old battleships that survived Pearl Harbor were too slow to keep up with the carriers and were held back on the west coast. Admiral Nimitz had only 3 aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise, the USS Hornet, and the USS Yorktown. And the status of the Yorktown was a major question mark. During the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, the Yorktown had been badly damaged. Japanese pilots reported her sunk. In reality, she was limping back to Pearl Harbor, trailing oil, with her internal frames bent and her flight deck compromised. The Japanese estimated it would take months to repair her. As far as Yamamoto knew, he was facing only 2 American carriers. The odds seemed overwhelmingly in Japan's favor. But war is not merely a game of numbers, it is a game of information. And while the Japanese fleet sailed in radio silence, confident in their secrecy, they were unaware that the Americans were listening. The fog of war that usually obscures the enemy's intentions was, for Admiral Nimitz, beginning to lift. Part 2: U.S. Intelligence Breakthrough. While the Japanese fleet prepared for battle with fuel and ammunition, the Americans were preparing with paper, pencil, and IBM punch card machines. The battleground for this phase of the conflict was not the open ocean, but a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, known as the Dungeon. This was the home of Station HYPO, the combat intelligence unit of the Pacific Fleet. It was a cramped, smoke-filled room staffed by a team of eccentric brilliants, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort was a nonconformist who often worked in a smoking jacket and slippers, but he possessed a unique genius for cryptanalysis. His team had spent months wrestling with the Japanese naval code, JN-25B. JN-25 was an incredibly complex additive code. It consisted of a book of 5-digit code groups representing words or phrases, to which a second 5-digit number, taken from a separate additive book, was added to scramble the message. To break it, you had to strip away the additive to reveal the code group, and then figure out what the code group meant. It was a mathematical nightmare involving tens of thousands of possibilities. By the spring of 1942, Rochefort's team was reading only a fraction of the Japanese traffic, perhaps 10 to 15%. But through traffic analysis, studying who was talking to whom and the volume of the messages, they began to see a terrifying pattern. The volume of radio traffic was spiking to levels not seen since just before Pearl Harbor. The Japanese were planning something massive. Rochefort's team began intercepting references to a target designated as AF. They saw orders for maps of AF, requests for supplies for AF, and flight plans to AF. The question that haunted the U.S. command was, where is AF? Washington, D.C.'s Naval Intelligence Unit, OP-20G, was convinced that AF stood for the Aleutian Islands, or perhaps even the west coast of the United States. They feared an attack on San Francisco or Seattle. They argued that the Japanese wouldn't risk their fleet for a rock like Midway. Rochefort disagreed. Based on previous intercepts and his intuitive understanding of Japanese strategy, he was convinced AF was Midway. The dispute between Pearl Harbor and Washington became heated. Admiral Nimitz, caught in the middle, had to decide where to position his precious outnumbered carriers. If he sent them to Midway and the Japanese attacked California, it would be a disaster. If he kept them near California and the Japanese took Midway, he would lose a vital strategic asset. Nimitz needed certainty. To get it, Rochefort devised a cunning ruse. He instructed the commander of the Midway garrison to send a radio message in plain language, stating that the base's freshwater distillation plant had broken down and that they were suffering from a severe water shortage. The message was sent, and the Americans waited. Soon after, Station HYPO intercepted a Japanese message from a listening post on Wake Island to Tokyo. It reported that AF is short of water. The trap had snapped shut. AF was confirmed as Midway. Rochefort had handed Nimitz the keys to the battle. Armed with this priceless intelligence, Nimitz could now do what Yamamoto thought impossible. He could ambush the ambusher. Instead of reacting to the Japanese attack after it began, Nimitz could position his forces to strike before the Japanese even knew he was there. But knowing the target was only half the battle. Nimitz still had to scrape together a force capable of fighting the Kido Butai. He ordered his carriers back to Pearl Harbor. The USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, under the command of Rear Admiral William Bull Halsey, arrived first. However, Halsey, the most aggressive carrier commander in the fleet, was suffering from a severe case of dermatitis, a debilitating skin condition that landed him in the hospital. In his place, Halsey recommended a quiet, intellectual cruiser commander named Raymond Spruance to lead Task Force 16. Spruance was not an aviator, he was a battleship sailor. Many pilots were skeptical, but Spruance would prove to be a master of calculation and cool judgment. Then there was the problem of the USS Yorktown. When she limped into the Pearl Harbor dry dock on May 27th, inspectors estimated her repairs would take 3 months. Nimitz looked at them and said, "We must have this ship back in 3 days." What followed was a legend of logistics. Over 1,400 shipyard workers swarmed the Yorktown, working around the clock in stifling heat. They patched the flight deck with steel plates, shored up the bulkheads with timber, and fixed the boilers. It wasn't pretty, and the ship wasn't fully restored, but she could sail and she could launch aircraft. On the morning of May 30th, just 3 days after arriving, the Yorktown, designated Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, steamed out of Pearl Harbor to join the fight. The Japanese, still believing she was at the bottom of the Coral Sea, had no idea she was coming. Nimitz's battle plan was based on the element of surprise. He ordered Task Forces 16 and 17 to proceed to a rendezvous point northeast of Midway, nicknamed Point Luck. From this position, they would be on the flank of the approaching Japanese fleet. The plan relied on precise timing. The Americans had to wait until the Japanese launched their first strike on Midway. At that moment, when the Japanese carriers were busy recovering their planes and refueling, they would be most vulnerable. Meanwhile, Midway itself was transformed into a fortress. Every available plane was rushed to the island, B-17 flying fortresses, PBY Catalina flying boats, and Marine Corps fighters and dive bombers. The pilots were young, many of them fresh from flight school, flying obsolete aircraft like the F-2A Buffalo, which the pilots bitterly nicknamed the Flying Coffin. They knew they were outclassed by the Japanese Zeros, but they were the first line of defense. By June 3, 1942, the pieces were set. The vast Japanese armada was steaming toward Midway in the fog, confident that the sea ahead was empty. Unbeknownst to them, 3 American carriers were already waiting at Point Luck, running silent, listening to the electronic whispers of the enemy. The intelligence war had been won. The Americans knew the who, the where, and the when. They knew Yamamoto's schedule better than some of his own captains. But intelligence only buys opportunity. It does not guarantee victory. As the sun set on June 3rd, the sailors and pilots on both sides tried to sleep, knowing that the morning would bring fire and steel. The strategic advantage had shifted to the Americans, but the tactical fight, the chaotic, bloody reality of aerial combat, was yet to come. The fate of the Pacific now rested in the hands of young men in cockpits, scanning the empty ocean for the first sign of the enemy. Part 3, June 4th, morning. The trap springs. The sun rose over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, revealing a calm sea and broken clouds. Perfect visibility for a bombardier, dangerous visibility for a fleet trying to hide. At 4:30 a.m., the flight decks of the Kido Butai roared to life. In a display of disciplined efficiency that terrified their enemies, the Japanese crews launched 108 aircraft in just 15 minutes. A swarm of Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo bombers formed up and banked south toward Midway. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Akagi, watching his birds fly. He felt confident. His scout planes had been launched, albeit some with delays, to search the surrounding ocean, but he expected them to find nothing. As far as he knew, the American carriers were still anchored in Pearl Harbor, unaware of his presence. His primary mission was to soften up Midway for the invasion troops. But the element of surprise had already evaporated. At 5:30 a.m., a PBY Catalina flying boat flown by Lieutenant Howard Adey broke through the clouds and saw the nightmare below, the entire Japanese carrier strike force. Adey keyed his radio and sent the message that would electrify the U.S. command. Many planes heading Midway. Minutes later, another PBY spotted the carriers themselves. On the bridge of the USS Enterprise, Admiral Spruance made a calculated gamble. The doctrine of the day dictated that you should launch a coordinated strike, fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes arriving together to overwhelm the enemy. But coordinating such a massive force took time, and time was the one thing Spruance didn't have. He calculated that if he launched immediately, his planes would arrive over the Japanese fleet just as their aircraft were returning from the Midway strike. The Japanese decks would be fouled with planes low on fuel and out of ammunition. He gave the order, launch everything. Meanwhile, the Japanese strike force reached Midway. The Marine defenders on the island fought ferociously. They were flying obsolete Buffalo fighters that were hopelessly outmatched by the Zero. It was a slaughter. The Marines lost nearly almost all their aircraft, but they managed to disrupt the Japanese bomber formations. The Japanese pounded the island's facilities, destroying hangars and oil tanks, but crucially, the runway remained intact. As the Japanese flight leader, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, surveyed the burning island, he realized the job wasn't done. The defenses were still active. The invasion force would be chewed up if they landed now. He radioed back to Nagumo. There is need for a second attack. This message hit Nagumo at the worst possible moment. He had kept his second wave of aircraft on the flight decks, armed with torpedoes, specifically to attack American ships if any were discovered. But now his flight leader was telling him Midway needed another pounding, and his scout planes had reported nothing but empty ocean. Nagumo, a man known for his caution and adherence to doctrine, made a fateful decision. He ordered the torpedoes to be removed from the planes on his flight decks and replaced with high-explosive land attack bombs. The hangars of the Akagi and Kaga became a chaotic hive of activity. Mechanics frantically lowered planes, unbolted heavy torpedoes, and rushed to load bombs. It was heavy, dangerous work, and in their haste, the crews didn't return the torpedoes to the safety of the magazines. They simply rolled them to the side of the hangar deck. The ships were becoming floating powder kegs. Then the fog of war descended. At 7:28 a.m., just as the rearming was underway, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone, which had launched 30 minutes late due to a catapult malfunction, sent a startling message. "Sight 10 enemy surface ships." Nagumo froze. Ships? What kind of ships? He fired back a demand for clarification. Ascertain ship types. For 15 agonizing minutes, Nagumo waited. If those ships were battleships or cruisers, he could handle them later. But if there was a carrier... At 7:45 a.m., the scout pilot replied, "Enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier." The blood must have drained from Nagumo's face. A carrier meant American air power. A carrier meant he had been ambushed. He was caught in a tactical nightmare. His first wave was returning from Midway, low on fuel, and needed to land immediately. His second wave was currently in the hangars, halfway through switching from torpedoes to bombs. If he launched the second wave now to attack the American carrier, they would have to fly without fighter escort, because his Zero fighters were needed to protect the fleet and the returning Midway strike force. It would be a suicide mission, but if he waited to recover the Midway strike force, he would have to clear his decks, delaying his own attack for at least an hour in which the Americans could strike him. Nagumo chose the prudent, doctrinal path. He decided to clear his flight decks, recover the returning planes, refuel and rearm the entire force with torpedoes, and then launch a massive, coordinated Grand Slam attack against the American threat. He ordered the mechanics to switch the bombs back to torpedoes. The hangar decks were now a frenzy of sweat and cursing, cluttered with unsecured bombs and torpedoes rolling on racks. It was a race against time, and Nagumo appeared to be winning. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, CAP, the Zeros guarding the fleet, were performing magnificently. Between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m., several waves of American land-based bombers from Midway attacked the fleet. B-17s dropped bombs from high altitude. Vindicator dive bombers glided in low. The Zeros swatted them all away. Not a single bomb hit the Japanese ships. Nagumo looked at the clock. It was roughly 9:15 a.m. His returning planes were landing. The Americans had thrown their land-based aircraft at him and failed. He believed he had weathered the storm. In an hour, he would be ready to launch his own devastating counterstrike and send the American carrier to the bottom. He didn't know that the sky above him was already filled with American naval aviators hunting for his ships in the vast emptiness of the Pacific. Part 4: Decisive Moments. The Miracle and the Inferno. The American strike force was not a coordinated hammer blow. It was a disjointed stream of confusion. The different squadrons from the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had become separated in the clouds and the long flight. They arrived at the Japanese fleet at different times, from different directions, and at different altitudes. First to arrive around 9:20 a.m. was Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, from the USS Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Waldron was a distinct, intense man, part Native American, who had told his men before takeoff that if he was the only one left, he would still dive into the enemy. He defied his air group commander's flight path, following a hunch that led him straight to the Japanese carriers. But he arrived alone. He had no fighter cover. His planes, the TBD Devastators, were slow, lumbering relics that had to fly low and straight to drop their torpedoes. As they approached the Japanese fleet, the Zero fighters patrolling high above swooped down like hawks. What followed was not a battle, but an execution. One by one, the Devastators were smashed into the sea. Waldron was one of the first to die, his plane erupting in flames. Of the 15 planes in Torpedo Squadron 8, all 15 were shot down. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, clinging to a seat cushion in the ocean, watching the rest of the battle from sea level. Minutes later, Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise arrived. They too were unescorted. They too were decimated. Then came Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown. They had some fighter cover from the F-4F Wildcats, led by Jimmy Thatch, who debuted the famous Thack-Weave maneuver to hold off the Zeros. But the result for the bombers was largely the same. The Japanese Zeros were tearing them apart. To the Japanese, this seemed like a victory. They had slaughtered the American attackers. Not a single torpedo had hit a ship. The Japanese fighter pilots were euphoric, their morale soaring. But in their zeal to destroy the low-flying torpedo planes, the entire Japanese combat air patrol had been drawn down to sea level. They were skimming the waves, chasing the last of the Devastators. The sky above the Japanese fleet at 15,000 feet was now completely empty. It was 10:20 a.m. Admiral Nagumo felt he had survived the crisis. The last of the American torpedo planes were being mopped up. On the flight decks of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the rearming was nearly complete. Engines were warming up. The Japanese strike force was minutes away from launching. High above, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the dive bombers of the USS Enterprise, was running on fumes. He had flown to the intercepted coordinates and found nothing. The Japanese had turned northeast. McCluskey faced a choice: turn back to save his planes, or keep searching and risk ditching in the ocean. He decided to extend his search. Then he saw a white streak on the blue water. It was the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, steaming at full speed. The Arashi had stayed behind to depth charge an American submarine and was now rushing to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey guessed the destroyer was heading to the carriers. He banked his formation and followed the wake. Minutes later, the Japanese fleet appeared on the horizon. At almost the exact same moment, the dive bombers from the USS Yorktown, led by Max Leslie, arrived from a different direction. It was a complete accident of timing, a miracle of coordination that hadn't been planned. The Japanese lookouts were focused on the horizon, watching for low-flying torpedo planes. The Zeros were all down at sea level. No one looked up. At 10:22 a.m., the American Dauntless dive bombers tipped over and began their dives. The steep, screaming descent from 15,000 feet is a terrifying experience. Gravity pulling the skin back from your face, the target growing larger in the scope, the anti-aircraft fire rising to meet you. McCluskey and the Enterprise bombers targeted the Kaga and the Akagi. The Yorktown bombers targeted the Soryu. The Kaga was hit first. A 500-pound bomb struck near the stern, followed by 3 more devastating hits. One bomb landed directly on the forward elevator, smashing through the flight deck and detonating in the hangar below, right in the middle of the fully fueled planes and the unsecured torpedoes. The explosion was cataclysmic. It blew the sides of the ship out. The aviation fuel vapor ignited, turning the massive carrier into a floating inferno. Seconds later, 3 bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Dick Best, dove on the flagship Akagi. The first bomb missed narrowly. The third missed, but the second bomb, dropped by Best himself, was a masterpiece of precision. It punched through the flight deck near the midship elevator and exploded in the upper hangar. The Akagi was the pride of the fleet, but she had a fatal flaw. Her hangars were enclosed, trapping the shock waves. The explosion detonated the stockpiled ordnance and fuel. The blast wave buckled the flight deck, tossing parked Zeros into the air like toys. Admiral Nagumo, standing on the bridge, was thrown by the shock. Within minutes, his flagship was a burning wreck, helpless and doomed. Simultaneously, the Yorktown's bombers slammed 3 bombs into the Soryu. The hits were perfectly placed. The Soryu's hangar deck, packed with rearmed aircraft, disintegrated in a series of induced explosions. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers of the Kido Butai, the force that had terrorized the Pacific, were reduced to blazing funeral pyres. The 5 fateful minutes were over. The course of the war had flipped. But the battle wasn't. 1 Japanese carrier remained, the Hiryu. The Hiryu, commanded by the aggressive Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, had been separated from the other 3 and escaped the initial onslaught. Yamaguchi watched the smoke rising from his sister ships and realized the burden of the Empire now rested on his flight deck. He did not hesitate. He radioed, "All units, follow Hiryu." He launched an immediate counterstrike, 18 Val dive bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. They followed the retreating American planes back to their source, the USS Yorktown. The Yorktown had a sophisticated radar system and picked up the incoming raid. The combat air patrol intercepted them, shooting down many, but 7 Japanese bombers broke through. They scored 3 hits on the Yorktown. 1 bomb blew a hole in the flight deck. Another exploded in the smokestack, extinguishing the boilers. The Yorktown lost power and drifted to a halt, black smoke pouring from her stack. But the Americans were learning damage control. The crews on the Yorktown worked with frantic speed. They patched the flight deck, put out the fires, and incredibly got the boilers relit. By 2 p.m., the Yorktown was steaming at 19 knots, refueling fighters. Yamaguchi launched a second wave from Hiryu, this time torpedo bombers. When the Japanese pilots arrived, they saw a carrier moving at speed with no smoke. They assumed it was a pristine, undamaged ship, a different carrier from the one they had just bombed. They set up their attack runs. The Yorktown maneuvered wildly, avoiding 2 torpedoes, but 2 others slammed into her port side. The shock was massive. The ship listed dangerously to port. All power was lost. Fearing she would capsize, Captain Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship. The stubborn Yorktown, the ship that refused to die, was finally silenced, drifting helplessly in the swells. Part 5. Afternoon. June. 5. The death of the Hiryu and the retreat. It was late afternoon on June 4th. The score was 3 Japanese carriers burning against 1 American carrier crippled. But as long as the Hiryu remained afloat, the battle was not decided. Admiral Spruance aboard the Enterprise knew that the surviving Japanese carrier was still a lethal threat. He had to find her and sink her before nightfall. Scouts located the Hiryu late in the day. Spruance scraped together a strike force from the Enterprise and the orphaned planes of the Yorktown that had landed on his deck. At 3:30 p.m., 24 dive bombers, many flown by pilots who had not slept in 30 hours and were fueled only by adrenaline and coffee, took off into the glare of the afternoon sun. They found the Hiryu around 5 p.m. The Japanese carrier was maneuvering evasively, her lookout spotting the Americans high above. Admiral Yamaguchi attempted to launch his remaining fighters, but it was too late. The American dive bombers, now veterans of the morning's success, pushed over into their attacks. The setting sun cast long shadows across the ocean, but the Hiryu was illuminated clearly. The Japanese put up a wall of anti-aircraft fire, but the Americans were relentless. 4 bombs struck the Hiryu in rapid succession. The impact was devastating. The forward third of the flight deck collapsed into the hangar. Explosions ripped through the elevator wells. The Hiryu, the last hope of the Japanese offensive, was consumed by flames. The circle of fire was complete. All 4 carriers of the First Air Fleet were destroyed. As night fell over the Pacific, the scene was apocalyptic. 4 great ships, the technological marvels of their age, lit up the darkness as they burned. Inside the hull of the Hiryu, Admiral Yamaguchi, widely considered Yamamoto's successor, gathered his staff. He announced his intention to go down with the ship. It was a ritual of atonement for the failure. He shared a toast of water with his captain, gave his hat to a subordinate as a keepsake, and tied himself to the bridge. Hundreds of miles to the rear, aboard the super battleship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto sat in stunned silence. The reports coming in were a litany of disasters: Akagi burning, Kaga burning, Soryu burning, Hiryu burning. The invincibility of the Imperial Navy had been shattered in 12 hours. Yamamoto initially tried to salvage the situation. He ordered his battleships to race toward Midway, hoping to catch the American fleet in a night battle where his massive guns would have the advantage. He wanted to bombard Midway into submission and force a surface fight. But Spruance was too smart to take the bait. He knew his aviators were exhausted and his carriers were vulnerable at night. He famously ordered his task force to turn east, away from the Japanese, during the night, preserving his distance. When dawn broke on June 5th, the American ships were nowhere to be found. Yamamoto realized the game was over. Without air cover, his massive battleships were sitting ducks for the American planes that would launch at first light. If he pressed on, he risked losing the main body of the fleet. The dream of seizing Midway, of threatening Hawaii, of dictating peace terms in Washington had evaporated in the smoke of his burning carriers. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, Yamamoto gave the order that marked the psychological turning point of the war. The Midway operation is cancelled. The retreat began. It was a somber, humiliated procession. But the Americans weren't done. For the next 2 days, Spruance pursued the retreating Japanese. On June 6th, American dive bombers caught 2 Japanese heavy cruisers, the Mikuma and the Mogami, which had collided while trying to avoid a submarine attack. The Mikuma was pounded mercilessly until she sank. The Mogami limped away, a ruin. Back at the site of the main battle, the ocean was reclaiming the giants. The Soryu and Kaga had sunk the previous evening. The Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, refused to sink despite the inferno. Finally, strictly on Yamamoto's orders to prevent her capture, Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into her hull. She slipped beneath the waves at dawn on June 5th. The Hiryu followed her shortly after. The human cost was staggering. The Japanese lost over 3,000 men, including their most experienced aircraft mechanics and their finest pilots, irreplaceable human capital that would haunt them for the rest of the war. The Americans lost the Yorktown, which was finally finished off by a Japanese submarine on June 7th while under tow, the destroyer Hammond and 307 men. But the strategic cost was incalculable. Before Midway, the Japanese held the initiative. They decided where and when the battles would be fought. After Midway, they would never win another major offensive victory. The U.S. Navy, having stopped the unstoppable force, now looked toward the horizon, not with fear, but with the grim certainty of ultimate victory. The road to Tokyo was open. Part 6. Pursuit and Cleanup, June 5–7th. The Long Retreat. The rising sun on June 5, 1942, illuminated a Pacific Ocean that had been fundamentally altered. The great clash of carriers was over, but the dying was not. The Battle of Midway had now shifted from a high-speed duel of aerial supremacy to a grim, bloody hunt. Admiral Yamamoto's main body, the massive armada of battleships that had trailed behind the carriers, was now retreating westward, a defeated giant slinking back into the shadows. Admiral Spruance aboard the USS Enterprise faced a critical test of command. His aviators were exhausted, his fuel bunkers were depleting, and his magazines were low on munitions. A more reckless commander might have charged west in pursuit of a complete annihilation of the Japanese fleet. But Spruance possessed a cold, calculating intellect. He knew that while the Japanese carriers were gone, Yamamoto still possessed a terrifying array of surface ships, including the Yamato, with 18-inch guns that could obliterate the American carriers from over 20 miles away. If Spruance pushed too far west, he risked sailing into the range of land-based bombers from Wake Island or being caught in a night engagement where the Japanese excelled. Spruance chose a measured pursuit. He would chase the Japanese, but he would not be lured into a trap. He would pick off the stragglers. The most tragic of these stragglers were two heavy cruisers, the Mikuma and the Mogami. In the confused darkness of the early morning on June 5th, a Japanese submarine lookout had spotted the shadow of the American submarine USS Tambor. Fearing a torpedo attack, the Japanese cruiser column executed an emergency turn. In the chaos, the heavy cruiser Mogami crashed into the port side of her sister ship, the Mikuma. The collision was catastrophic. The Mogami's bow was crushed back nearly to her forward turret, leaving her unable to make speed. The Mikuma, though less damaged, stayed behind to escort her crippled sister. They were now isolated, limping slowly away from the protection of the main fleet, perfectly exposed under the clear blue sky. On June 6, the American dive bombers found them. What followed was not a battle, but a mauling. Spruance launched wave after wave of dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and Hornet. The American pilots, frustrated by their earlier difficulties in locating the main fleet, took out their aggression on the two cruisers. The Mogami, despite her crushed bow, fought back ferociously and managed to survive immense damage, limping away to eventually undergo repairs that would keep her out of the war for a year. The Mikuma was not so lucky. The American bombs shattered her superstructure. Her torpedoes, loaded in tubes on the deck, cooked off in the heat of the fires, detonating with force that ripped the ship apart. The famous photograph taken later that day shows the Mikuma as a twisted ruin, smoke pouring from her shattered funnel, a testament to the absolute dominance of air power over surface ships. She sank that night, taking 650 men with her. While the Japanese were retreating, a separate drama was playing out near Midway, centering on the ship that refused to die, the USS Yorktown. When Captain Buckmaster had ordered "abandon ship" on the afternoon of June 4th, the Yorktown was listing heavily and dead in the water. Most assumed she would capsize within the hour. But when the sun rose on June 5th, the Fighting Lady was still there. She was scarred, burnt, and listing, but she was afloat. Admiral Nimitz, seeing an opportunity to salvage a third of his carrier force, ordered a salvage party to return to the ship. A volunteer crew, including Captain Buckmaster, boarded the listing carrier. They began the perilous work of cutting away heavy guns to reduce the list and counter flooding compartments. Remarkably, the ship began to right herself. The destroyer USS Hammond pulled alongside, tying up to the carrier to provide power and water for the pumps. For a few hopeful hours, it looked like the Yorktown might actually be towed back to Pearl Harbor. But the Japanese were not done. The submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been prowling the area, dodging American destroyers. Tanabe displayed nerves of steel. He navigated his submarine through the protective screen of US destroyers, creeping silently toward the stationary target. At 1:30 p.m. on June 6, Tanabe fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. The lookouts on the Hammond saw the bubble trails in the water. They screamed a warning, and the destroyer's crew frantically tried to fire their 20mm guns at the water to detonate the torpedoes, but it was too late. One torpedo struck the Hammond amidships. The explosion broke the destroyer's back. She jackknifed and sank in less than 4 minutes. As she went down, her depth charges, armed and ready for action, detonated underwater, killing many of the sailors who had just jumped overboard. 2 other torpedoes passed under the sinking destroyer and slammed into the Yorktown. The shock was the final blow for the battered carrier. The salvage crew was forced to evacuate once again. Tanabe and the I-168 escaped the subsequent depth charge fury of the American destroyers, returning to Japan as heroes who had claimed the only major American prize of the battle. The Yorktown lingered through the night, a silent ghost on the water. Finally, at dawn on June 7th, she rolled over and slipped beneath the surface, descending 3 miles to the bottom of the Pacific. She had absorbed the punishment meant for the entire American fleet, and in doing so, she had bought the victory. Meanwhile, thousands of miles to the north, the sideshow of the Aleutian Islands campaign was concluding. The Japanese Northern Force managed to bomb Dutch Harbor and land troops on the desolate islands of Attu and Kiska. It was the first time an enemy had occupied United States soil since the War of 1812. But in the grand context of Midway, it was a hollow victory. The occupation of 2 frozen, fog-shrouded rocks in the middle of nowhere offered no strategic advantage and would only serve to tie up Japanese resources in a pointless defense for the next year. By the evening of June 7th, the seas around Midway were empty. The Japanese were gone. The wreckage was sinking. The Battle of Midway was officially over. Part 7. Casualties and Historical Significance. As the smoke cleared, the magnitude of the event began to crystallize. In the cold calculus of war, Midway was an annihilation. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the battle as the most powerful carrier force on Earth. They left it broken. They lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. They lost the heavy cruiser Mikuma. They lost 248 aircraft and over 3,000 men. The United States lost the carrier Yorktown, the destroyer Hammond, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. But numbers alone do not tell the story of Midway. To understand why this battle is considered one of the handful of true turning points in human history, we must look at what was actually lost. The most crushing loss for Japan was not the ships themselves, though they were expensive and difficult to replace, but the human capital. The pilots of the Kido Butai were the samurai of the sky. They were an elite brotherhood, trained for years, with thousands of flight hours and combat experience in China and across the Pacific. At Midway, Japan lost a significant portion of this cadre. While many pilots actually survived the sinkings rescued by destroyers, the loss of squadron leaders and flight commanders decimated the organizational structure of the naval air arm. Even more critical, and often overlooked, was the loss of the aircraft mechanics and ground crews. When the bombs struck the Japanese hangars, they detonated amidst the fueling and rearming operations. The men who knew how to keep the Zeros flying, the highly skilled technicians, were incinerated. Japan could build new planes and eventually new carriers, but they could not mass-produce experienced mechanics or pilots. From this point on, the quality of Japanese naval aviation began a steady, irreversible decline. Strategically, Midway cured the Japanese of victory disease. For 6 months, they had run wild, believing in their own divine destiny. Midway shattered that illusion. The initiative passed instantly to the United States. Before June 4, 1942, the Allies were reacting to Japanese moves, desperately trying to plug holes in a crumbling defensive perimeter. After June 4, the Allies dictated the pace of the war. General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz could now plan their own offensives. 2 months later, US Marines would land on Guadalcanal, beginning the long, bloody march toward Tokyo. The battle also highlighted a fatal flaw in the Japanese approach to war, a lack of industrial depth. Japan was fighting a war of quick, decisive battles because it knew it could not win a war of attrition. The United States, conversely, was just waking up. At the time of the battle, American shipyards were already laying the keels for the Essex-class carriers. While Japan struggled to replace the 4 carriers lost at Midway, the United States would launch 24 Essex-class carriers before the war ended. Midway was Japan's only window of opportunity to force a peace settlement before the American industrial juggernaut crushed them. When the Akagi sank, that window slammed shut. There is also the what-if factor. Had Nimitz lost at Midway, the consequences would have been terrifying. The Japanese would have occupied the atoll. They would have established an air base within striking range of Hawaii. Pearl Harbor would have become untenable as a major naval base, forcing the U.S. fleet to retreat to the California coast. The war in the Pacific would have been prolonged by years. Australia might have been isolated. The resources the U.S. poured into the European theatre to fight Nazi Germany might have been diverted to defend the American West Coast, potentially altering the outcome of the war in Europe as well. Midway also vindicated the concept of naval intelligence. It was the first battle in history decided primarily by codebreaking. Commander Rochefort and his team in the basement at Pearl Harbor proved that a few geniuses with pencils could be as lethal as a battleship. The victory cemented the importance of signals intelligence, a legacy that continues to the modern day in organizations like the NSA. Ultimately, Midway destroyed the Japanese naval doctrine of the Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle. They had sought this battle for decades, designing their entire navy around the idea of luring the American fleet into a trap and destroying it. They finally got their decisive battle, but they were the ones who were destroyed. They were beaten not by a superior force, but by a flexible, adaptable enemy that refused to play by their rules. Conclusion. The miracle. The Battle of Midway stands as a monument to the unpredictability of war. It is a story of razor-thin margins. If the Japanese code had not been broken, if the repair crews had not fixed the Yorktown in 3 days, if the scout plane from the cruiser Tone had launched on time, if Admiral Nagumo had launched his second strike immediately instead of following doctrine, if the American torpedo squadrons had not sacrificed themselves to draw the Zeros down to sea level, if Wade McCluskey had turned back when his fuel ran low, if any one of these things had happened differently, the world we live in today might look very different. Historians often hesitate to use the word miracle. It implies divine intervention rather than human agency. And indeed, Midway was a victory of human agency, of Rochefort's brilliance, Nimitz's daring, Spruance's calculation, and the raw courage of pilots like Dick Best and John Waldron. But when the dive bombers of the Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet at the exact same moment, coming from different directions, arriving at the precise second when the Japanese defenses were most vulnerable, it is hard to describe it as anything else. It was the perfect storm of preparation meeting opportunity. Midway was the fulcrum upon which the history of the 20th century turned. In the burning wreckage of the Kido Butai, the myth of Japanese invincibility died, and the grim inevitability of Allied victory was born. The ocean swallowed the ships, but the legacy of those few desperate hours remains. It serves as an eternal reminder that in war, Superior numbers and technology are never a guarantee against a determined enemy, armed with the truth and the courage to act on it. The story of Midway is filled with individual heroes, many of whom never returned home. From the codebreakers in the dungeon to the torpedo pilots who flew into certain death. Who do you think was the MVP of the Battle of Midway? Was it McCluskey for his decision to keep searching, Rochefort for cracking the code, or perhaps the repair crews of the Yorktown? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to see more deep dives into the turning points of history, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Until next time.